Thank you all for being here today. It's great to see everybody. While we're getting set up, I'll just give a brief overview of what we do with China Owns Us. So a lot of you have heard in the news about China. You know, we hear all the time about Hong Kong, the Uyghurs in Xinjiang province, Taiwan is a big issue. We have this, and most people, according to polling, are very concerned about China today, as they should be. It's really our arch rival. It's going to be the battle of the century in many respects between us and China. But what people don't understand is how much influence the Chinese government already has in America. It's been going on for decades, and it's much worse than anybody thinks. And so what we do at China Owns Us is we're a little bit different from a lot of China analysts who talk about military issues and so forth. What we try to do as a project, what our goal is to communicate to people about how much influence there is in America today that affects you, how it might affect the actual you as an individual, how the Chinese government is targeting you as an individual. So it's not just sort of an abstract military discussion about, hey, if we go to war over Taiwan or this and that. Those kind of debates are had at a very high level, and they're often very abstract, and they're out of our control at the end of the day as individuals. But there's a lot of stuff going on that does affect us, and there's a lot of policies that we could be implementing today to protect ourselves, both as individuals or individual rights, as well as a country to put ourselves in a much better position relative to China, where we are not currently today. I'd say today we're in a very strong position of weakness, so to speak. Next slide. So here's what's at stake. You know, right now, the US for many years has been sort of the sole global superpower after the Cold War. China threatens that. They want to be the global dominating force. They don't want to share it with anybody. They want to take us down and make us subservient to a communist China. That's the government of China's approach. So our current technological and economic advantages, they can go away. And in fact, they are very close to going away. Our autonomy as a country is at stake. And frankly, the whole world order, the free world especially, but the whole world order is at stake. So in the short term, I want to talk a little bit about Made in China 2025, which is their goal to dominate 10 key industries. This is artificial intelligence, ocean engineering, high-tech stuff that's going to be important. The Chinese government in the short term is trying to dominate these industries within the next few years. They want the rest of the world feeding out of their hand, including America. And the long-term goal is going to be global domination. So how have they gotten here? Soft power has been how the Chinese government has really gotten its hooks and influence into America so far. Soft power is things like diplomacy, influence peddling, creating economic ties that they can use to create a conflict of interest so that people will not oppose them. And it's a smart policy because it's often very, very, very under the radar. And I'm going to surface some of these things today that have been going on for the soft power influence. But what it leads into in the long term is hard power. You've probably seen some stories about how the Chinese military has expanded. Its navy is now larger than ours by ship count. They were just caught building a bunch of new nuclear missile silos. So the hard power capabilities are increasing. But before that, their strategy is use soft power, get as much advantages as you can over the economics and the politics and the culture of a country, and then you're in a position to strike. So it's very, it can be deceptive at times, but it's also a very smart and clever strategy. This is a map we have on our website, and we have a lot of information on our website. I only have about 20 minutes today to give you a very broad overview of Chinese influence in America. But here's a map that talks about it on our website. On our website, you'll also find a bunch of videos and a white paper that go into much more detail about these. But this is just a map of Chinese influence, and this is the tip of the iceberg, by the way, tip of the iceberg. But next slide, please. They have areas of influence in corporate America through mergers and acquisitions and investments in businesses, through the media by buying ads and also by kind of whining and dining reporters. Education, they have set up Confucius Institutes at many schools, including K through 12 schools and universities. And political, they've hired many former members of Congress to lobby for them, both Republicans and Democrats. So on the corporate side, China and Chinese companies have made over 2,000 corporate acquisitions or direct investments in American companies. And what's different here, there's some companies here, I'll just go to the Legendary Entertainment Group. You've probably seen them in front of some major movies. They're a major Hollywood production company. Motorola Mobility, high-tech company, and cell phones. Nexteer Automotive, car company. I can give you a whole list of these companies, and many of them are going to be in the energy field, healthcare, and other technology fields, and also media. And the reason for that is the Chinese strategy has been to kind of get as much technology as they can from other countries, including America, that are more advanced, to catch up. And once they've caught up, then they can surpass. So basically they've used both legal and illegal spying means, corporate espionage, to get technology, to get access to technology. And it's been a big problem. It's gone on 2,000 times. It's actually decreased in recent years, which we think is an indication of they have gotten where they need to get, have gotten a lot of what they need to get, and now they can, on their own, advance themselves. Next slide. So there's this old saying from Lenin, and this is really the problem with our China policy over the last 20 years. 20 years ago, they got let into the World Trade Organization, and so it sort of normalized them as a trade partner. And so a lot of businesses moved over to China, and now it's kind of like a Roach Motel. You can check in, but it's hard to check out. And part of that is this old saying from Lenin. The capitalists will sell us the rope with which we hang them, right? So there's this short-term mentality that we have in a capitalist system sometimes where it's, hey, what's our next quarterly earnings? What's our next stockholder report? Very short-termism. The Chinese government, in our political system too, there's a joke about if you win an election to the House of Representatives, what is the first thing you do? Run for re-election, right? So it's very short-term philosophy and mentality in a lot of areas of American society. The Chinese government has a very long-term approach. They don't have elections, right? Xi Jinping is not an elected guy. So they don't have to worry about that kind of stuff. They are just the guys at the top who have total control, their dictatorship, their authoritarianism. And so they can have these sort of long-term agendas, these 5-year plans or 50-year plans, and slowly implement them very strategically. Next slide. So here's where we are. Why is this a problem? Well, here's where we are today. 97% of our antibiotics, this is at the beginning of the pandemic, 97% of our antibiotics came from China, either the raw materials or the processing. That's huge. They could cut off our entire medical supply. And about 85% of our generic drugs were also coming from China too. So the previous administration tried to take some steps to reduce this. They recognized it as a problem. But this is where we were just 2 years ago. That's bad. You have a hostile foreign government that can just cut off your entire medical supply. They can do devastation to our medical system. 30% of our PPE at the beginning of the pandemic was coming from China. So again, there were a couple instances where they would just not let masks get exported to other countries. And they can do that. And that's the problem with having them in control of your supply chains. Rare earth minerals are another big important one. So rare earth minerals, it's these materials basically that make technology work. Little materials they use in chips and other technology. So computers, any kind of modern electronics needs rare earth minerals. And we have been stockpiling this, but China controls about 80% of the global supply. So again, they can cut that off from both America and other countries, and they can use it as a tool, again, sort of to push people around and say, hey, if you want to pass this law that kind of cracks down on China or that does something we don't like, well, we might just cut off some of your medicine. We might just cut off some of your supplies to rare earth minerals that you need for your economy. So this is the position we're in. It's a position of weakness. Next slide, please. So semiconductors is another big issue that's going to be, I think, in the forefront of the Taiwan issue. So Taiwan, what does it matter if China invades Taiwan tomorrow? Does it really affect us? Well, here's how it would affect us. Whether or not it's a good, all other Taiwan policy aside, Taiwan's responsible for about half of the world's semiconductor production. And South Korea is about 25% through Samsung. So those two countries alone control 75% of the semiconductor market. And again, you need semiconductors to make any kind of technology product work these days. So you heard about the big chip shortage in cars. Probably heard some stories about that. Again, imagine that, but like 100 times worse. That's the kind of stuff that's at stake here. To switch gears to the media side, how has the CCP tried to influence the media in America? It's in a few different ways. A few years ago, they were caught running a secret radio network in America, including they ran a station outside Washington, D.C., and were broadcasting into the Capitol. And so they basically found a loophole in the federal rules that allowed them to, through front groups in America, lease airtime at stations across the country. So they had a couple in Houston, I think 1 or 2 in Dallas, D.C., Philly, Boston, San Francisco, and so forth. They had all these radio stations that were just blaring out Chinese government content through China Radio International. And again, they found a way around the rules, but they were just broadcasting that in communities. They also stream stuff, Chinese government TV, they can stream it online now. But a big thing is also people are afraid of China. And so Hollywood, the very perception of China we have through mass media has been influenced by the Chinese government. They want to tamp it down. So about 25 years ago, there was a movie that came out called, I think it was Red Corner with Richard Gere. And it was a murder mystery plot that involved a Chinese government cover-up. And he got blacklisted from China because of the pushback from the Chinese government to that kind of plot line. And so you also might remember a movie around the same time, Brad Pitt, 7 Years in Tibet, right? Tibet is a very sensitive issue within the Chinese government. They don't want any criticism over Tibet. And so again, that kind of stuff back in the late 90s you could make. These days you won't make it at all. Richard Gere actually went to Washington, D.C. and testified about a year ago on Capitol Hill. And he said, yeah, I've been blacklisted because of that movie and my personal advocacy. Studios are afraid to make movies with me anymore because they think the Chinese government will then ban their other movies from being aired in China. So again, it's kind of the carrot and the stick. So the movie theaters want to access the big Chinese market with all the movie theaters over there. But the Chinese government controls what's shown in China. And so Hollywood has kind of gotten down and kowtowed to these people and said, hey, okay, we won't make any more movies that are critical of you. We won't make any documentaries about things like Hong Kong. They just won't do it. And it's not just necessarily even an explicit agreement. They're just afraid of China. They're just afraid of China. In fact, if you go back to the Sony emails that got hacked back in 2014, they're published online, you'll see some people from the Chinese government going in and trying to woo the executives of some of these major Hollywood companies. Influence in the mainstream media as well is another big one. So China Watch, you might have heard about this. You might see this in your paper from time to time. It looks like it looks like real news, right? It looks like a news insert. It's actually paid for by the Chinese government. And they've spent tens of millions of dollars placing these kinds of ads in the Wall Street Journal, in the New York Times, even in regional papers like the Des Moines Register. And so, again, since 2016, $50 million they've spent, the Chinese government has spent on these kinds of ads, and our papers run them. They run Chinese government propaganda. They also use, again, sort of the schmoozing angle, the wine and dine angle. So about 10 years ago, they use a variety of front groups, front organizations that are friendly to them, and they set up free junkets for reporters. They go, oh, we'll give you a paid trip to China, we'll show you around, we'll show you what the country's like, you've never been there before. And so, of course, the handlers on that kind of trip are all designed to push the party line and to influence the people, their targets, to have a pro-China point of view. And these are some major people that they've wooed over the years. People at CNN, New York Times, and so forth have gone on these junkets. And again, the people, a lot of it's subconscious, right? It's about psychological warfare. The people themselves might say, well, I think I'm independent. I don't think I'm being wooed by China. But on that sort of subconscious level, you're like, oh, geez, these guys have paid a trip for me, thousands of dollars, nice hotels, nice food. That kind of stuff does wear on people's mentality about who they're talking about. Education is another big one. So Confucius Institutes and Confucius Classrooms, these are programs that are funded by the Chinese government. And what they did was they used the educational arm of the Chinese Communist Party. They went to US universities and they said, hey, we'll have a partnership with you, we'll give you some instructors and they'll teach Chinese classes for you and we'll fund the whole program. And a lot of universities said, hey, that sounds good, free money, we'll take that for instruction. And so they get these instructors over, and then next thing you know, they start pushing propaganda in classrooms, or they start trying to put their finger on the scale on campus activities. We've heard of instances where the Dalai Lama wanted to go speak at a university that had a Confucius Institute, and then behind the scenes there's all kinds of pushback going on because they want to control, again, what kinds of ideas people are exposed to on campuses. It's all about controlling the perception of China. And part of that soft power thing, soft power versus hard power, the Chinese Communist Party is very smart about biding its time very quietly. But in doing that, they of course want to control the image of how the rest of the world views the government in Beijing. And so this is all designed to kind of tamp down any kind of opposition to the Chinese government or any kind of negative imagery about the Chinese government. Thankfully, it's largely failed based on polling, but that's what this is all designed to do. And it's not just targeting college students, it's targeting kids in K through 12 schools too. So they use the institutes at universities to then go and to local schools and say, hey, we'll have a Confucius classroom, we'll take your 10th grade class on a trip to China during summer break, that kind of stuff. And again, that's all soft power influence. That's all what they're trying to do. There's several 100,000 Chinese exchange students in America pre-pandemic. And again, the Chinese government views all of them as potential assets to do their work on campuses. A lot of campuses, Harvard and so forth, have access to high-end technology and cutting-edge research. And that's what this is designed to do. And if you only have 1% success rate out of 300,000, that's still a lot of assets on universities. And lastly, they had a thing called a 1,000 talents plan to try to recruit professors. So professors, people in high positions with a lot of technical knowledge that China wanted, they tried to recruit them secretly to do work on the side with them and kind of bring them into the fold in a subversive way. And so what happened was you had professors over the past couple of years get charged with secretly working for China. And some of these cases have actually not gone so well for the government. They've made some mistakes. But it's an issue. And then now the establishments on campus are starting to push back in this sort of left-wing establishment saying, oh, this is just racial targeting of Chinese professors. So it's not, but this is now turning into almost a debacle in some respects with what's going on. And here's one more thing. So under the Trump administration, the Department of Education investigated universities for failing to report foreign donations. And this is from all kinds of foreign countries, so not just China. But when you add up all the China money over the past 10 years, it was about $2 billion in undeclared money. So the universities were supposed to reveal, hey, we've got this contract with China, we got this gift from China of 100 grand from an individual on the mainland. They weren't doing that. And so once you add up all that, once the government made them reveal, hey, you need to abide by this regulation, $2 billion suddenly popped up from China at American universities. So to switch gears to political, so we have something called FARA, F-A-R-A, the Foreign Agent Registration Act. And if you do business and lobby for a foreign entity, foreign government, you're supposed to declare that under federal law. And so here's China's number. The most recent numbers is for 2020 was over $60 million, and that's in declared activity. 60 million declared activity. So there's a lot going on underneath the table, as we've seen. But this is stuff they're wanting to declare publicly about Chinese companies that are lobbying, as well as Chinese government lobbying. And the issue here is, unlike America, inside China, there is no difference between a company and the government under the communist system. Here in America, we have a very distinct line between government and private business. That does not exist in China. Companies that are allowed to exist in China, if they're called upon, they have to do what the party wants, or the party's not going to let them exist. And so any asset that, even if it looks like, oh, it's just a private company that deals with forestry or that kind of stuff, no, view all companies as an extension of the Chinese government. And so again, that's very significant lobbying. And so who have they got lobbying for them? Well, wow. some pretty big names on both sides of the aisle, right? Former senators, former representatives in Congress. So Trent Lott, you probably heard that name, pretty big guy in the Republican Party, not too long ago, 15, 20 years ago. He was one of their lobbyists in recent filings. And so these guys, the joke in Washington, of course, is, once you get out of Congress, you just become a lobbyist and lobby your old friends. That's been going on for a long time. But these guys are now doing it for China. I mean, that's crazy. But it's going on. It's going on. And the other funny thing that's going on too is the Commerce Department has actually blacklisted some of these Chinese companies because they go, hey, these companies are really just engaged in spying for the Chinese government with their tech. But these same companies that are on a blacklist by one agency are actually still allowed to lobby the federal government, and they are doing it. So Huawei is a big one, Hikvision's another. But these Chinese companies, they get blacklisted on one end, and then just go hire a former member of Congress and say, hey, get us off that blacklist. So it's kind of a joke. It's really an indictment of our political system that this is allowed to even happen. And lastly, on the political side, think tanks. So the sort of the DC think tank network, that whole sphere of influence. Think tanks are very influential in generating policy, which then they pass on to the offices and say, they have the events like these to promote their policies. And they've gotten some connections to some pretty big think tanks in town. And we're developing this research right now. We hope to have a report out in about a month or so, naming some names here. On a personal level, your data and your DNA are actively being sought by the Chinese government. Your data on your phone, as well as your DNA, is being actively sought by the Chinese government. This is a government. One of the things that's hard to imagine about China is it's a country the same size as the United States in terms of its physical geography, but the population is 5 times bigger, right? 5 times more people in China. It's a huge amount of manpower, What that also means is with a huge communist government bureaucracy, they can just have people sitting around all day just doing data collection on as many people as possible. I mean, that's why they're allowed, that's why they can be everywhere. You know, it's not just America being targeted. They're doing the same kind of stuff in Europe and in other countries as well. They have sort of a very aggressive economic policy in the Caribbean and in Africa. They're everywhere, and they have the manpower to do it. And so one of the things they want to do is collect data on as many people as possible. Obviously, it started with their own people, keeping them in line, the Chinese citizens. But now it's expanding to everybody else. Through hacking, through apps, they own game companies that are very popular in America. And so what they can do with these applications is, you know, put a little thing in the terms of service that this person can sell the data to somebody else, a third party, and then maybe the third party sells it to a Chinese entity. Or maybe they just invest in the company, maybe they own the company. And so really, you know, they might promise, they might tell you, you know, our official statement is that your data is secure. Well, of course it is. But is it really? Something like TikTok. So a lot of kids use TikTok, and what you might have seen a couple months ago over the summer is TikTok changed its terms of service. And there are a couple stories that recognize this. So TikTok now says, we can collect your biometric data, such as your voice print, what you sound like, as well as your face, right? Because TikTok's a video app. And if you think about that, how could that be used against somebody? Well, have you ever heard of something called a deep fake? A deep fake? So they can make fake videos these days. The technology's there. They can make a fake video of anybody in this room, basically saying something very offensive that would end your career. Use your imagination on that one. That's the kind of technology we have today. If you want to see it in action, Google Tom Cruise deepfake. Somebody made a deepfake of him earlier this year. It was really scary how good it was. And this is one video guy in Belgium, and he made this video as a warning to say, hey, if I can make this, imagine what a government with a lot of high-tech people on staff could do. And so this kind of stuff can be used to blackmail anybody at that point. You know, they can go after corporate CEOs, go after politicians in other countries, the Chinese government can, and just make these videos up out of whole cloth and say, we're going to put this on the internet if you don't do what we want you to do. 60 Minutes did a good piece on China and DNA. I invite you to check it out. I can't talk, I know I'm running a little bit long, so I don't want to talk too long. But I will say, next slide, this story just came out this past week. Check it out. It's at the Washington Free Beacon. So there's a genetics company in California that the FBI says we're confident that they are sharing health data with China. And this kind of stuff is happening all the time. And what will happen is you might send, let's say you send you do one of these genetic testing companies. So you go, oh, you know, I don't want to name names because I don't know that they all necessarily do this, but some of those companies, if you take an at-home genetics test, you go, what's my ancestry? Well, what happens to that data? A lot of those companies will resell that data. They'll package it up and resell it to third parties. And so the Chinese government has the opportunity, and probably, I assume, has already taken it, to get large quantities of data on American DNA, American population DNA. They have it of their own citizens, and they use it to surveil and weed out Uyghurs. But they also want to collect it on foreigners as well. So why might they do that? One of the reasons they might do that is there's speculation they're trying to develop a bioweapon, an ethnic bioweapon. So imagine a new form of COVID that doesn't affect people of Chinese ancestry, right? Something like that. It's creative and really scary. But if you have population level DNA, that might be an application you could look into. And with the Chinese government, I would always assume the worst. I mean, they're communists after all. And this last slide here, the Chinese government is already killing us. They're already killing us. They are responsible for most of the fentanyl entering this country. And some of it comes with the mail, some of it gets tracked in through Mexico, but it's produced over in China. And so the DEA says China is the main source for fentanyl trafficked into the United States. And they're killing us. They're killing us by the tens of thousands already. It's a huge epidemic. And this is all coming from China, and they don't care at all. Their job is to create chaos in America and in other countries, because chaos in those countries, if we're fighting each other internally, well, it helps them in their position to just grow bigger and solidify their position. So let's talk about that in concluding. Hard power. So China is now expanding its power into other countries, so its sphere of influence. They were, one example, they were running a secret prison in Dubai. That got out in the news recently. They have the Belt and Road Initiative, which you may have heard of, but what that sold, what China does is they make loans to poorer countries. They say, hey, we'll build a new port for you, and we'll finance it, and you'll pay us back over time. Well, the way these deals are structured, the fine print of these loans is obviously advantageous to China. So it allows them, there's clauses in there that allow them to maybe influence local policies, or maybe even just say, hey, you're going to default on this loan, and so we can then do what we want with the port, use it for espionage, whatever else. The Chinese Navy, I mentioned, is now larger than the US Navy by ship count, and that's expected to grow. Secret missile silos. So this is in the New York Times a couple months ago, but some researchers were looking at satellite imagery and they figured out, hey, the Chinese government is in this very remote area building a bunch of nuclear missile silos. Well, why would they be doing that? I mean, I think we can put the pieces together on that one. So they're expanding their hard power. They've been using their soft power for a long time to gain advantages over other countries. And that's where we are today. It's not a good position, but that's where we are. So there's some good news. There's some good news. I don't want this to be too much of a depressing talk here, but it should be a warning. It should be a warning that we're in a really bad position where we are. So there's been some good movement here. Confucius institutes are starting to close. Many have closed already. The university have gotten pressure. It's the old saying that sunlight is the best disinfectant. So these have gotten exposure. The universities have felt embarrassed, and they've started to close them down. The reduction in Chinese investment I mentioned in the US is good, but it's also worrying that maybe they've already stolen everything they'll need. The ban on Xinjiang products, there was a ban put in, that's good. There's some pushback there. And there's been a lot of pressure on companies to move their supply chains out of China. And some have been, so directionally, that's going in the right direction. Is it moving quickly enough? Hard to say, I would say no. But here's where we are. We've looked the other way for years and kind of just had a hands-off policy under both the Bush administration and the Obama administration in regards to China. And that really let them, for 16 years, grow their position immensely in the world as well as inside our country. I don't think we're moving fast enough. There's a lot of good ideas out there that are being pushed in Congress that I think will do good things, both on data privacy, DNA privacy, and other things as well. But I don't think we're moving fast enough. And lastly, weak leadership invites aggression. So you can read between the lines on that one, but if you're China, view China as kind of like a predator. If you're thinking like these videos you see on Animal Planet with the pack of wolves going around and like which elk do they go after, right? It's the wounded elk, almost always, or the baby elk. And so, think of this in very, very basic natural terms. The Chinese government is a predator. They're a global predator. And who are they going to pick off next? Well, whoever looks the weakest, right? They want to eat everybody. And they go for a low-hanging fruit. But if you look weak and they go, hey, we think we can make some progress here, that's going to be what they do. That's going to be what they do. It's not hard at the end of the day. They're very aggressive. They're very expansionist. And they're very hungry dragon. So with that, here's my email. If you ever have any, if you want to reach out, this is my email, cog@americansecurityinstitute.com. Yeah, I see a question over there.